Good evening. My name is Jeff Schock. I'm one of the pastors here at Crossroads. I'm excited to be able to share tonight's teaching as we continue through our series, Eden to Exile. And I'm going to be reading from Exodus chapter 14, verses 5 through 31. The word's going to be on the screen behind me. I'd invite you to follow along. Exodus 14, verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go, and we have lost their services." So he had his chariots made ready, and he took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea at Pi-Hahiroth, opposite Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. This is the word of the Lord. This is an interesting text to have for Good Friday. This is the story of Israel crossing the Red Sea, getting out of Egypt. I want to make the case tonight that there's probably no better text to illustrate the significance of the cross of Jesus. And let me make my case. As we're going through this series, Eden to Exile, we are looking at this theme of Exodus in the Bible, and we've been saying all along that there is a fundamental problem we all sense. Every human who's ever been born understands at a level that they are on the outside. There is something separating them from God. We all have a kind of existential angst. The Bible says we are all in exile. And this text is probably the epitome of the exilic stories in the Bible. This is Israel being delivered from Egypt into the promised land. And here we have the story, the moment it was, if you will, that God delivers them. There's at least 24 references in the Old Testament to the crossing of the Red Sea. The number of references in the New Testament to the crossing of the Red Sea are almost uncountable. Matthew 2:15. Matthew quotes Hosea 11. He says, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And the son in the story is Israel. And so what Matthew is doing is he's connecting Jesus' work with the story of the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing. In Luke 9, on the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus goes up the mountain with some of his disciples, and he encounters Moses and Elijah. And as they're speaking, they're talking about Jesus' departure. And just in case there was any kind of mystery about what's going on here, the word departure that is translated from a Greek word, guess the Greek word, Exodus. This is Jesus talking about his departure, going to the cross, and the language he chooses is Exodus. Hebrews 3 and 4 all make the case, if you read them carefully, it makes the case that Jesus is very much following in the footsteps of Moses. He is like Moses in many respects, but far better. And then Hebrews 11:29 says that it is by faith that the Israelites passed through the waters on dry land, and it was exactly the opposite of that for the Egyptians. They couldn't do it because they didn't have the faith. And so the writer in Hebrews is using the Red Sea crossing to show us what it means to have Christian faith. And then finally you get to 1 Corinthians 10. Where it says that the Israelites that passed through were baptized into Moses. And in verse 6, Paul says that these things are written as examples to us, as Christians. The story of the Exodus, specifically the story of the Red Sea crossing, points to something, and it points to Jesus. I read a story this week as I was preparing this. It was kind of a warm anecdote. Somebody had related in a book, and when he was at seminary many years ago, he found himself sitting in the living room of a pastor and theologian many of you may recognize, John Stott. He was very influential. He passed away a number of years ago. And they were sitting in Stott's living room, a bunch of college kids, and there was an Old Testament scholar there, a man by the name of Alec Moiter, and he has since passed away. But they're sitting on the living room floor, and the narrator was relating how this Old Testament scholar, this ivory tower intellectual, is sitting down with these college students, and he's explaining to them how the crossing of the Red Sea shows us a picture of the cross, and how this story of deliverance and redemption points to the redemption that we'd have through Jesus. And this is what he said. He said, think about it. Think about what an Israelite would say on the way to Canaan, having come out of the Red Sea and so forth. Here's what an Israelite would say. If you said, "Who are you?" he would say, "I was in a foreign land under the sentence of death, in bondage, but I took shelter under the blood of the Lamb. Our mediator led us out and we crossed over, and now we're on our way to the promised land. We're not there yet, but he's given us his law to make us a community, and he's given us the tabernacle because you have to live by grace and forgiveness, and his presence is in our midst, and he's going to stay with us until we get home." This story is about that story. And this is the story of Eden. The title of this series, if you took the time to read the whole thing, it's a little long. It says, Eden to Exile and Back Again, an Easter story. And it's a story of redemption. And we have to ask a couple of questions of this text tonight and the cross in particular. The first one is going to be, what are we redeemed from? And the second is, how are we redeemed? And the third is, how does it work exactly? So the first, what are we redeemed from? Redemption is an actuarial term. Think about it. If you had a coupon, you took it to the store, you would redeem it. And it literally means to loose something, to set it free, right? And this is exactly what you see right here at the beginning of the narrative. In verse 5, you find out that the Hebrew people had been enslaved in Egypt for a very long time, hundreds of years. And then there's a series of plagues, and God is working providentially through Moses to deliver his people. And then Pharaoh, he lets him go, but it doesn't take him long to change his mind. I love verse 5. It's almost comical. What have we done? We've let the Israelites go, and we have lost their services. 400 years of slavery, we're describing it as services. I thought that was a little comical. But now they're being pursued. Pharaoh has come to his senses and he thought, oh my goodness, our slave labor force is taking off towards the Sinai. And they start pursuing him, and they've got the whole army out and they're getting after him. And Israel does what they always do. They start complaining. It's not the first time they've done it. And by the way, when you look, you can go back into Exodus when they all came before Moses, and when Moses had laid out his plan that God was going to deliver him, they bowed down, they worshiped the Lord, they were pumped. And all of a sudden here, the minute the going gets tough, Israel starts, what are you doing? You brought us out here. There weren't enough graves in Egypt. You brought us out here to die. And it's not the first time, it's not the last time they would do it either. Again, later on in Exodus, they would complain, oh, we had pots of meat in Egypt, and you've led us out here to the desert. And so Israel is, they're back and forth, and they're a picture of us. They're a picture of us. And they're in bondage, and what happens when you become a Christian is you get set free from bondage in a number of different ways. You get set free from God's wrath. The wrath of God is, this is how one commentator described it. He said, God's wrath is his settled judicial opposition to evil and sin. It's his settled judicial opposition to evil and sin. It's not vengeance. It's not comeuppance. If God is perfect, if he is holy, then he must be a perfect judge. And Romans and the rest of the New Testament all speak to the fact that none of us have been able to balance the scales of justice on our own. And so we all fall under the wrath of God. And what this says is that, well, the Christian message is essentially that we are redeemed. We are redeemed. We're set free from that. We no longer have that hanging over our head because of Jesus. And so this is, by the way, this is the Christian doctrine of justification. The moment you put your faith in Jesus Christ, if you believe in your heart and you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved, it says in Romans, and that is the doctrine of justification. You have been justified. The moment you put your faith in Jesus, you are set free. You'll never have to sit under the wrath of God, and it happens instantaneously. Everything you've done. James says he will remember your sins no more. And then the other thing you get set free from is the power of sin. This is freedom from being under the law. And here's how this works. We all know we should do better, don't you? Am I the only one? But we all have a sense that we haven't quite done well enough. And I talk to people all the time as a pastor and a friend, and a father and a husband, and it seems like this is the constant theme. Oh, I just didn't do well enough here, and I wish I could be better. I think we all have that sense. Here's the problem. Being told several times that you are saved by the blood of Jesus, and that your sins no longer are going to be held against you because of his sacrifice on the cross won't quite do it. There is something that happens because we've all been under the law, right? You can read the Old Testament, that law, or just the one that you've imposed on yourself that tells you you should have done better. We walk around, and those old enemies rattle their sabers from time to time. And here's a great illustration. David Martin Lloyd-Jones was a pastor, an Anglican pastor in England, and he used this illustration. He was preaching on Romans. He said this. He said, imagine you were in the American South about 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed. And let's say you're a black person and you're walking through a town in the American South, and though you are legally free, the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed and you are a free person, it would be entirely possible in that situation that perhaps a white Southerner would walk up to you and maybe yell at you, and all of a sudden you would snap back into a kind of slave mentality. That's his illustration to show us that we might know intellectually, cognitively, that we have been set free from the law, that it no longer holds any power over us, yet we still kind of act like it. When you encounter Christ, and you understand, and here's the deal, you can't just hear it a couple of times. This is something that you meditate on for a lifetime. People have said that, the gospel is the initial set of propositional truths that a Christian needs to consider and understand in order to be saved. And so there's this kind of caricature that says, well, the gospel, that's like elementary stuff. That's what you have to consider to become a Christian, and then you get baptized, and then you move on. You learn Greek and you study the Old Testament. You peer into the gospel for a lifetime. You peer into it for a lifetime. This is why you need Christian community. You need people around you to remind you that you're not under the law, that you've been set free. So when those old enemies, when those old idols show up and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not good enough. I'm never going to make it. I'm not sure if God loves me. You've got the gospel drilled into your heart. You never stop meditating on it. You consider it, and it's got 100 different ways you can consider it. But you're set free from bondage of the law. And by the way, that's if you're set free from your past, that's justification. If you're set free from your present, the present temptation of sin in your life, or the temptation to try and work and earn your salvation when Jesus has already paid it all, that's sanctification. That's freedom in your present. And guess what's coming? At some point in the future, you will be set free completely from the presence of sin and evil, and that is glorification. And so we're set free from these things, and we're no longer under condemnation. And fundamentally, what salvation means, Christian salvation, means that you've been set free from bondage. How? In verses 13 and 14 of Exodus, which I'll read again for us, let's just take a look. It says, Moses answered his people and said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." It almost sounds like what it says at Romans 4, where Paul writes, "However, to the one who does not work but trusts God who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness." On one side of the sea, Israel was under the threat of death. They had the most ascendant military power, all the chariots, all that stuff chasing them. They were underarmed. They were definitely going to get killed. And the moment they crossed over, they are no longer under the shadow of death. They are under the shadow of life. The threat is gone. God made sure of that. For Israel, all it took was going from A to B, and all of a sudden they're delivered. And this is the essence of the Christian story. Every other faith tradition, every other religion which has ever existed, and I'm always looking at the little tiny obscure ones just to make sure this is a true statement. Their faith consists of building a bridge, putting in pilings, building more of a bridge, putting in more pilings, and maybe eventually you'll get to the other side. And it's not a crossing over, one and done. It's a punctiliar, and it's a process, and you may get there and you may not. Christianity is unique in that sense. It is instantaneous because it's a change of status. I thought of a couple ways to illustrate this. First one's a bad idea. I'm going to do it anyway. The Simpsons. There's this episode I love, and you'll know why in just a second, but Homer is visiting Australia with the family. The Simpsons are down in Australia, and he comes to the U.S. Embassy. And then he finds out that the U.S. Embassy is actually legally U.S. sovereign soil. And so he does what I think many of us would do. He jumps from one side of the line to the other side of the line. He's like, "I'm in Australia, I'm in the U.S., I'm in Australia." And then a Marine punches him in the face and says, "We don't do that kind of stuff in America." And that's why I like the story. But it's a change of status, just like you were stepping over an international boundary. One second you're in the U.S. and 1 second you're in Australia or Mexico or whatever. There's maybe a more somber way to look at it, or perhaps less silly. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of presiding over a wedding here, and I think some of you saw the pictures. Brandon and Valerie tied the knot. Yay. It was cold. We were down at the beach, and I had one of the sweetest pleasures of my life is I got to give away the bride. And we walked down the aisle, and then I also did the ceremony, just kind of about face real quick. And at one moment in that ceremony, I get to say something. I get to say, "I now pronounce you man and wife." And in a moment, they went from being two people to one flesh. Something has been called the mingling of souls, right? And there's a change of status, and it's instantaneous. That's what it means to be a Christian. You have put your faith in Jesus. You believe in your heart that he's the Son of God and that he's risen from the dead. You're putting your faith in him for this life and the next, and your status changes instantaneously. And that's how it happens. And that is at variance to every other faith tradition. I tell you, when I was, I'll never forget this picture. I was asked to do some photography for a friend of mine who had a child in foster care for many years. Well, the day had finally come where they were going to adopt this child. And so I went down to the Superior Court in Palo Alto, and we're there outside this courtroom, and there's just family and friends and kids, and it's this really joyous occasion. And then they, it was weird because they marched a couple of guys out in chains, but we're going in there for this other thing. And we went in there, and it was just a fun, warm thing. It was a little weird to be in a courtroom, but nevertheless, at one point, the judge slammed his gavel, and those three individuals went from being to two people and a child to being a family, and it happened all at once. And it just took the judge saying that is so, and all of a sudden it was. This is the essence of the Christian faith. You're not trying to strive. You're not going to build a bridge slowly over 20 years. The moment you put your faith in Jesus, he puts his love on your life. He forgives you. Your life has been covered by the blood of the Lamb. Now, some people will say, well, okay, I get it. Salvation is by faith through grace in Jesus, so I'm going to try to believe really, really hard. Well, I want to point something out. I hope the Prince of Egypt movie was like running through your head as I was reading the passage. I just love that one. But it says they walked through and there was a wall of water on their left and on their right. And this is a bit speculative, but I bet you some of the Israelites had all kinds of faith. They're like, wow, can you believe this? Can you believe what God is doing? Look, a whale. Can you believe this, guys? Holy cow. But I bet you there were some of them who were walking around like, oh, we're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die. And I want to point out something important. It is not the quality of your faith that saves you. It is the object of your faith that saves you. And if you've look, what does Jesus say? He says, look, the faith the size of a mustard seed can move a mountain. And maybe you're here tonight and you're thinking, I have a seed of a faith, but my goodness, I don't think I can move mountains. I'm here to tell you that is the object of your faith that saves you, not the quality of your faith that saves you, and that is good news. Let me illustrate this with another stupid analogy. Let's say I wanted to fly to, where am I flying? Let's say I wanted to fly to Paris tomorrow, of all places. I'm going to Paris. It's been a dream, not really. But I'm going to Paris. I don't like to fly, but statistically, it's still the safest way to travel. Would you agree? Now, let's say my faith, the quality of my faith in that airplane might be terrible. I think, oh, this is the one, we're going to die a fiery death over the ocean, I'm sure of it. But the object of my faith is still the safest way to travel. It's still pretty good. Hypothetically, if I got myself all wound up and said, you know what, I think I can fly to Paris on my own if I just hot glue a bunch of chicken feathers to my arm and I jump off the roof. I might have all kinds of confidence in that plan. I might have deluded myself into thinking this is a grand idea and it's totally going to work. I think I remember doing stuff like this like before the age of 20. The quality of my faith would be high, but the object of my faith is terrible. So here, in Christianity, and this is a unique facet of the faith. It is the object of your faith that saves you. It is Jesus that saves you. Now, how does it work? I'm going to ask the worship team to come back up. I want to explain this last point. And, oh Lord, help me do a good job. In Genesis chapter 1, we've been looking at this whole journey from Eden to exile and back. And in Genesis 1, you find out that the earth is formless and empty, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the deep. And God was hovering over the waters. And then the very first thing God does is he separates the waters and creates dry land. And there is, if you're a Hebrew person, this would have been a lot more accessible to you because dry land good, water bad. There was a lot of superstition around the water that, when Jesus says it would be better for you to be cast into the sea with a millstone around your neck, that would have been a very loaded statement. People understood that. And we're talking about the first, ancient times, the ancient Near East. If you're out on the water, you're in a tiny sailboat. And if you've ever been out on the water, you know that it can go sideways really quick. And when God separates the water to reveal dry land, he's essentially creating order out of chaos. And that's the fundamental teaching of the Old Testament. It's the story that we see play out again and again as we went through Genesis, from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel to Noah. When people turn from God, chaos ensues. Consider what happens in a marriage if one of you won't forgive the other. Chaos ensues. And it's unless something changes, it is doomed, it is fatally ill. Consider what happens in a friendship where perhaps one person is jealous of the other, or one person wounds the other, and there's no restoration. Chaos enters into it. Now, the floodwaters and the New Testament describes them, they are a metaphor for God's judgment. That was the case in Genesis 6, and the flood waters were emblematic of God's judgment on the earth. And you see this same theme play out. You see it in the story of Jonah, where he is cast into the sea in a storm. And the question is here, why is it that Israel was able to walk through and not Egypt? They weren't a whole lot better than Egypt. It's worth noting. They end up, they're giving Moses a really hard time here. It would just be a couple of chapters after this. They're sacrificing to a golden calf, precipitates mass murder. The only difference between Israel and Egypt in this paradigm is Israel doesn't have any power. So how is it that they're able to walk through? Why wasn't Israel destroyed? Well, they had a mediator. In verse 14, what does it say? It says, Moses answered, or they're crying. They're saying, in verses 10, I'm sorry, it says, was it because there were no graves in Egypt you brought us here to die? And then the Lord rebukes Moses. In verse 15, he says, then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. So here you have somebody who is so tied to Israel's national identity that when they sin, Moses ends up getting the rebuke. He ends up receiving the penalty. And then you look further on in verse 21 where it says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. Here you have somebody who is so associated with God that his power actually flows through him. So on one hand, you have Moses the mediator, who is so associated with the people of Israel that he is actually culpable for their guilt. And then at the very same time, you have somebody who is so closely associated with God that God's power flows through him. Hebrews makes the case that Jesus is a new and better Moses. And what does he say? In Jonah 2, 3 through 6, it says, you hurled me into the depths, the very heart of the seas, and the currents swelled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. It sounds an awful lot like when Jesus is on the cross and he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And in Matthew 12, Jesus says, the men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. You see, they threw Jonah into the water, and his sacrifice calmed that storm. And Jesus was crushed into dust. He put 1,000 hells on his shoulder, and it calmed the storm in your life. The judgment that was meant for us, and by the way, the flood, it's almost always emblematic of judgment. When you see flood waters in the Old Testament, that has been assuaged by Jesus. In Exodus 32, Moses says, save them, but blot out my name. And God doesn't do it. He saves Israel anyway, but he doesn't blot out Moses' name. But you know what? Every bit of God's wrath landed on the shoulders of Jesus. And that's how it works. This passage where it says God is fighting for you, it gives me chills. it's appropriate for us to think about the cross tonight. And if you read the crucifixion accounts and you read them carefully, you have all these elements in there. From the hour of about 3 o'clock on, darkness covered the land. Darkness, that's God's judgment. And Jesus is on the cross and he's screaming out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why are you so far from me in the hour of my groaning? That's the rest of Psalm 22. Jesus on the cross, he's feeling the complete cosmic abandonment of God. And when you think about the cross this week, tonight, I want you to see it maybe in a different light. I want you to see it as God fighting for you. Because what does it say in Romans 4? It says, be still. There's nothing that you can do to get God to love you anymore. He loves you to high heaven. He went to the cross for you. That's how much he loves you. And if you were the only one who would ever call on his name, he would still have done it. There's a quote by a fellow who was in Charles Wesley's Bible study about 200 years ago. And they were reading the commentary, Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians. And this fellow's name was William Holland, and he was barely literate, but this is what he wrote in his journal. What then? Have we nothing to do? No, nothing, but accept Christ, who has made unto us wisdom, righteousness, sanctification, redemption. Have we nothing to do? No, nothing. Be still. The very last thing Jesus says on the cross, in all the synoptic gospels, it says he cried out with a loud voice and he gave up his spirit. It's only in John's gospel that you know what he said. And he says his very last words, it is finished. It's the Greek word telestai. And it's the word you would write on a bill of sale when it had been paid in full. And that's what the cross means. That's God fighting for you. It's God fighting for you. It's finished. This is his word.